One thing that I promised I'd show and then forgot about is that you can do mass creation of sandbox items. So if I go ahead and create an empty object here, and then I add the sandbox item creator utility to it, I can, in this list here, drag in a bunch of prefabs and apply the sandbox item component to them. So if I had some like Unity plugin, actually, just for the sake of example, I'm gonna go ahead and download a Unity package that is just some random free asset pack. Low poly nature, sure. Hit download, import. And then it's imported here to simple nature pack. I can then go ahead and in this prefabs folder, I can see there's a number of objects. So what I want to do is I select this temporary game object that has the utility script on it. I hit this lock icon so that I don't, I can click other things and it's not going to change the inspector. I then shift left click so I click at the top, then shift left click all the prefabs, drag them over to this slot here. So there's 24 objects in total. And then click set up sandbox item. And it says 24 sandbox items were configured, which is the correct number. And then if I go ahead and unlock here, and then I click on one of these, I should see that there is a collider, which they already have mesh colliders, which is good. And then there is also a sandbox item SDK object. So just like that, I now have support essentially for this entire random Unity free package of objects. And then I can go to create new plugin. What's this called? Simple nature pack. Apply that prefab grouping there. And then build. This one's gonna have a lot more to upload since there's 16 objects. But it worked. And then back in here, actually, I don't even need to leave the room I'm in. We're still in this world here. I can go ahead and create, add a new plugin, my plugins, simple natures down here. It's got our snowflake, and you can see a preview of all the objects, and then hit add. And then if we go back here, we should see simple nature. I can also search, so if I want, say, flowers, I should be able to search and get flowers up here, yep. And spawn them like that. A rock. Anything you want. So just like that, you know, you can convert lots of objects into your world to play with and have users designers playing around, not ever having to touch Unity, and just basically be able to iterate more quickly and also have ways to play around with it. So hope that that is helpful. So this is part 2 of our intro tutorial series for the Agora World SDK. Last section we did the initial setup and the world creation. Now we're going to do plugins. So I'm going to go ahead and clear my console so it's all clear. Thing about plugins is essentially a plugin in Agora World is a collection of sandbox items that can be spawned inside of the app itself into a world, and then you can save basically the configuration of those sandbox items as a sandbox, and those sandboxes can get applied to your experiences. So the sandbox layer kind of sits alongside it on top of the world layer. So you create a world, it's kind of the base layer of your experience, and then in the app itself, you can go ahead and use plugins to add more things to your experience. And do so in a networked environment with other users as well. So let's go ahead and create our first plugin. To do that, first thing I'm going to do is make a new folder under assets called, let's call this coolest plugin. And under there, I'm going to go ahead and make some folders right off the bat. One is for prefabs, another one for materials, and I think we're good for now with that. Then I'm going to go ahead and open back up this Agora World SDK folder. You'll notice in the plugin SDK folder, there's this empty scene. So I'm going to go ahead and open that so that I have an empty scene to work with and don't have anything to kind of mess with stuff. Then I'm going to go ahead and create a new 3D object. Make it a cylinder. And then this cylinder, I'm going to make a material for it. And let's give it a non-standard color here. Deep blue, yeah. Then I'm gonna go ahead and make this into a prefab down here. And then let's go ahead and make one more object. Sphere. And then we'll go ahead and duplicate that material, rename it. And then we can change the material color to purple. All right. Last thing, we need to make this a prefab. Generally, it's better to name these something different, so I'm going to go ahead and name this sphere. And the cylinder will be Groovy Cylinder. Now, we have our prefabs, which we want to spawn, and they're pretty simple prefabs. The one thing that we need to do is add sandbox item compatibility to these prefabs. And there's a couple ways to do this. The easiest one, if you're working with only a couple objects, is to go ahead and hit add component, search for sandbox, and sandbox item creator utility will come up. That object, you can then go ahead and click this set up sandbox item button. And essentially what that will do is it will apply, if there's no collider, it will apply a collider that fits the mesh of the object. If there already is a collider, which there is in this case, it'll stay the same. And then it will also add this sandbox item SDK script, which is necessary for it to function. One other thing you can do, now that we've done this, of course, this hasn't been done on the prefab, it's been done in the scene. So you want to hit this override button and apply all. And that will now, if we check our scene or our sphere of purpleness over here, we'll see it has this. The prefab name and the instance name, these get set dynamically, so these don't have to match necessarily. But if you wanted to, you could update it just if you were trying to keep things consistent. Now, this cylinder, a different way you can add it is we already have the cylinder. We don't want to make any override applies or anything like it. We're going to go ahead and actually delete these objects from our scene. But we want this groovy cylinder to still be a object that is a sandbox item. So what we can do is we can go ahead and hit add component sandbox item creator utility. And actually, I just realized I think I've messed up because I've done this before, and I don't think that this will actually work, but we can try it. Yep, so it did not work. So this is an easy thing that can trip people up. Even I was about to do it, but obviously I know a little bit better since I made this. But basically, if you try to use this editor script on an item that's in your project window, it's not going to work. And the reason is it needs to have a scene instance to work correctly. So this will fail. So what we need to do is we need to drag our groovy cylinder into here, which is now in here. Hit this button here, set up sandbox item. Oh, we may have fully broken it. This is in sandbox editing mode, or sorry, in prefab editing mode here. Yeah, none of that is working. Okay, well, clearly we did something that it did not like. So what I'm gonna do is hit apply all after deleting that object. And then gonna go ahead and add a component just like we did before. Sandbox item creator utility, set up sandbox item, and now it works. So yeah, if you get stuck, take the item off, make sure it's in the scene, and then hit apply all. Now, just for the heck of it, if we go ahead and check this object, it has things set up correctly. Same with this object. Just to reiterate, it needs to have a sandbox item SDK when everything is all said and done, and a collider somewhere on the object. We can go ahead and delete this. And let's go ahead and create our plugin, and then we'll come back and show both some other ways to add, to create sandbox items on mass, as well as how to do some other stuff with the plugins. So plugin SDK, if you haven't signed in, go ahead and sign in, and go ahead then and hit create new plugin. We'll give our plugin a name. We're calling this the coolest plugin. Then now the most important folder here is the plugin folder. That is a folder that only contains the prefabs that you want to upload. So we don't want to upload this entire top level folder because it's going to have wasted duplication of data potentially. What we want to do is we want to just upload this prefabs folder there. When you upload it, you'll see a bunch of things happen here. Sometimes it happens multiple times, but basically, you know, we get the reference. And then we can click it and it'll be here. We want to select a feature image. Let's go to pictures, select our snowflake, sure, why not? It is still winter at the moment. And then plugin description, a cool plugin. Now, the only other thing that I want to point out before we go ahead and publish this is some of the other ways that things can go wrong here. So if I go ahead and hit publish, but I'm in a scene that has some issues in it that might cause like, you know, some errors or whatnot, there could be some issues with the publish process. So what I recommend is that you use this empty scene that we've provided for hitting the build plugin process, because when we build, it does enter play mode for a short time. It's possible that you can you know, use your scene and it'll work fine. It often does, but just as a note, if you're having issues, make sure that you load up an empty scene. It doesn't have to be this one, it can be some other empty scene with no behaviors in it. Some other things that can go wrong are if you forgot to attach the sandbox item here. I'm actually going to go ahead and close the World SDK window so that we don't accidentally use it. But basically, if this object is not attached, or there's a collider missing, then when you go ahead and hit this build plugin, it's going to say generating images, and it's like, please try again, and it'll keep saying that no matter what. If you see that, double check both these objects have the necessary attachments here. The first time, sometimes if you have a lot of items, if you try that, it might show that, and actually you can try again. But if you try it a couple times and it's not working, then you definitely have an issue there. The final thing of note is that if you have a ton of plugin items, there can be issues sometimes. We haven't benchmarked fully what the top upper limit is, but I think around, I don't want to say the exact number because it also, we might make changes to fix that, but I've noticed that if I have a ton, like 60 plus items, it can cause issues. So if you're getting that generate images issue or some other error and you have a lot of plugin items, that might be the reason why. So let's go ahead and hit build, and it finished. So you know it worked correctly if you see this plugin upload finished debug log message. If you're not seeing debug logs, make sure that this is checked on. You can totally ignore this native collection has been disposed error. It's not going to cause any issues for you unless you open basically thousands of uses of this without ever restarting your computer. Yeah, so you can totally ignore that. And now we're ready to test. One other thing you can see here, as with the worlds, is the size of the plugin. This one's even smaller, only 28 kilobytes, because it's just two shapes. And then the files that were uploaded. So to test, we go ahead and go to Unity, sign in to our same account that uploaded it. We have our test experience. If you don't have an experience existing, you need to create one. But then, when you're in this editing screen, this is, we call it the master edit page. We need to do a couple things. So the first thing we need to do to test this is add our plugin that we just created. If we try to do that and we don't have a sandbox equipped, it's going to ask us, hey, do you want to create a sandbox? And the answer is yes. It's also going to say, hey, do you want to select it? And then we hit select, and then it will go ahead and select it. We can see that it's applied up here. Hit back, and then go into our plugins section here. We can ignore this error. This is simply saying we don't have any plugins yet, which is fine. Apply to this particular sandbox. We may remove that error in the future just so it doesn't confuse people. And then you want to go to My Plugins. And then you can add a plugin, which is right here. Select. It's loaded. We see our plugin here. And then we want to go ahead and hit Edit in World. So we're in our world. You'll notice on the left there's some tips on how to use the toolbox. But we hit T, we hit Create. And because we already added the plugin, we'll see our plugin here. We just click on this, and it should show our different plugins. Looks like something went wrong with the image generation of the sphere of purpleness. Not entirely sure what happened there, but I'm gonna guess that if we click it, yeah, it'll create the correct object. If this will be something we try to test in this session, but yeah, go ahead and just click on the items, hit T to bring this menu back up, and we can spawn items. We can select them and duplicate like that, and we can obviously move them and do whatever we want with them. So it is clearly working. We're able to spawn our objects in here. If we had joined the room in Edit in World and we didn't add this yet, we could have added it through this menu here with the plus button, My Plugins, and same thing, we go ahead and find coolest plugin, and then we hit add, and then it would show up here. So we've created our environment here, our sandbox, how we want it, but let's make one more. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit save, T, and then save, and save complete. All right. So our plugin's working. Let's go ahead and go back to Unity. Going to clear the console. Now we need to think about what we want to add next to this plugin and what changes we want to make. I think one thing that I'm hoping is that if we re-upload, it will fix this issue. There's some image caching that happens, so that might be the reason that this image was incorrect. In the worst of cases, we could always go ahead and like put this in the scene, delete the prefab, and then remake the prefab. That would almost certainly fix the issue. So yeah, we'll see if it fixes itself. If not, we may do that. But new object. So the thing that's amazing about our SDK is that you don't just need to do simple shapes. You can do pretty much anything that Unity supports out of the box. Any component, any Unity built-in stuff is essentially supported in Agora and supported through the SDK. So we're going to get a little zany here and create something a little bit more unique. Let's go ahead and create a 3D object. Actually, let's create an empty object so that we can have full control over how this is going to work. And we're going to call this the zany particles. So zany particles, as you can probably guess, we're going to add a particle effect. So particle system. We now have some particles that are spawning. Some important things we want to loop because we want it to be permanent. Once it's created, play on awake makes it so that if it spawns, it's going to just automatically start playing. So we want that as well. And then we're probably going to want to apply some sort of material to it so that it doesn't look like this pink material missing color that Unity uses. So in order to do that, we're going to make a new material. Zany particles matte. We're going to then drag that into the slot here for material. And then because this is a default shader right now, or default like rendering mode, it's going to be opaque. It's not really the best use of the particle system. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is change this to an unlit color. And then I'm going to go ahead and just change this to some sort of, let's see, what do we want this to look like? Maybe like an orange, deep orange. Yeah. Now I could spend a long time trying to mess with the particle system. Particle creation is definitely an art, and takes a lot of time to make it look good. That may be a separate tutorial. For now, let's just use the particles how they are currently coming out, and leave it at that. So we have this particle system, but again, it's not yet a supported Unity type, a supported Agora type. So we need to add sandbox create utility, set up sandbox item, and you'll notice that by default it's creating a massive collider because of the nature of the particles. This is probably not what we want to do because it's going to make it very large and kind of unwieldy to move around and things. We probably want the emission point to be the collider. Now, there's lots of ways that we can play with this and things you might want to do. I mean, this is also, again, like down to your design decisions. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to adjust the box collider on this to be smaller. Here, and like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and move this box collider closer to the emission point. Oh. To something like that. So now when people are trying to target in Agora to move and manipulate this object, it's going to be based on the emission point rather than some other larger bounding box. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and make this a prefab. Trying to think if there's any other craziness we want to add. Maybe what we can do is duplicate this object. Delete the original. It doesn't really matter, I guess. But now we're going to add another component like a rigid body just for fun and make it use gravity, continuous collision detection, and then basically it'll have some physics to it. 0.5 mass, and trying to think how we can simply make this more interesting. Maybe yeah, let's just leave it at that for now. Actually, I know what we can do. We can make it, instead of a box collider, a rounded collider. And once again, we're going to need to reduce the radius of the object and move it closer to where we want it to go. One other note I want to make on colliders is right now all these colliders are actually going to affect player movement when you're moving around. And for something like this, where it's a particle effect, we probably don't want to actually physically influence where the player's going. We can go ahead and hit is trigger, and all that's going to do is make it so that the player is able to go through it, and we can still interact with it using Agora World to manipulate and move it, but we just won't run into it. So this one's going to be called Zany Particles Physics. And I just realized that because I made it a trigger, it's not going to have the physical interaction we want. So I'm actually going to turn that off, make it a prefab, original prefab. And then this other Zany Particles one, the first one that we made, I am going to make it a trigger. So this one's not going to have physical, collision. But this other one that we made with physics and a rigid body to move it around is going to have physics. And this is all off the cuff, so if it doesn't work, that's part of the journey. But this is just showing just how quickly you can kind of play with and create things that you can then have in our networked experiences. So we have our improvements. I'm going to go ahead and reapply this prefab folder here, and then go ahead and update the plugin. As a reminder, it automatically enters update mode after you publish the first time, but if you were going to this for the first time, or like in a new session, just hit update plugin, find the plugin that you created, which in our case was coolest plugin here, and then we just have to apply the full folder one more time, and you'll see it reapplied it, and then hit update. As a reminder, if this play button ever is blue after you publish, something went wrong, and yeah, you need to check the different things that could possibly be happening. Now, back in here, this update again is not going to show until we leave and come back, so I'm going to go ahead and leave room. Go back to my experiences, edit the tutorial world experience here, and then hit edit in world. Now you'll see that the objects that I saved are still there. We didn't modify them at all. If these had been modified, the locations would be the same, but then the objects would have the changes that we had made. So that's both a good thing and sometimes a bad thing if you're trying to make changes that are not going to change people's, or rather your experience. Then you need to create a different plugin for that. But if you're okay with the changes showing up in whatever world has them, then you can make those changes. Now we see the purple is correct, and our particle images don't have any images because they're particle systems, they emit. Something you could do would be to have some sort of object with custom code that maybe disappears. If you really wanted there to be some sort of preview here, maybe we'll add support for custom of these in the future, but they do need to be pretty small since it's loading a lot of data and they're searchable. But yeah, let's go ahead and test. Is any particles? Oh, and we see as I move around, the emitter location changes. So I'm going to go ahead and put this one here. Nice. And I can select it again, move it, do whatever I want with it. Now let's try to mess with the particles with physics, which will probably be fairly interesting. Oh, and there it goes. It rolled away from us. Never to be seen again. Well, unless I actually move it over here, which I caught just in time. So yeah, things get wonky with physics, so be careful. But yeah, balls versus colliders, that's why sphere colliders are not a good idea generally unless you want things rolling around. Oh yeah, now it really gets physics going. And the other thing with particles, just to be wary of, is they are much more expensive than just single objects. So just be careful with adding too many to your scene. And yeah, if these fall off now like they are doing, they're going to be gone forever down there somewhere, and if you save, they'll show up there. So be very careful with adding physics to sandbox items like this. Generally, it's better to have a single sandbox item that is like placed and then spawns the physics objects rather than physics on the sandbox items, just because if you lose them somewhere and then hit save, they're going to be down there and, you know, who knows where. All right. I think that's all that I wanted to show for this section. So hope that you enjoyed, and come to the next section or watch the next tutorial video for details on how to use custom code in both your plugins and your worlds to add, you know, that extra level of customizability. So not only can you use Unity objects, but actually any code that you can imagine in the next section. Thanks.